So yes, I work on literature of the Romantic period in the main, and it's taken me quite a long time, as Will's introduction suggested, to sort of make the move into talking about romantic writing and nature and ecology. And it's quite a natural thing to do, really, because often the roots of modern ecology or modern environmentalism are often seen to have begun in the Romantic period with people like Wordsworth and John Clare and so on. And when people write about the sort of history of nature writing, often it's the Romantic period where people go to as an important sort of flowering of a cultural interest in representing non-human nature, and through those representations engaging with non-human nature. I've just finished a book a very short book on romantic writing and climate change in line with that catastrophe project. And then this is largely new material for me, so it's not a scripted talk. I've got some idea of what I'm going to say, please know, but it's through slides, and I'm really interested in questions and discussion. It's not sort of a matter of me just sort of throwing stuff at you and then that's it. So feel free to ask questions and raise issues at the end. One of the reasons I've enjoyed putting this talk together so much is because in the last couple of years I've become interested in bird watching. Probably a few bird watchers here. In my case, I think it's a sign of incipient middle age. But it's also, I find, a very sort of restful and pleasurable activity. And I think for me, and I'm not generalising about bird watching for anyone else, but for me, I find kind of two urges sort of, to some extent, in contradiction with each other. There's the urge to sort of classify and control, to tick things off the list, to sort of have a sort of schema and sort of put it on to the natural world. It's a sort of collecting urge, and I recognise that in myself when I go bird watching. And my father-in-law is a very, very, very keen twitcher, so a sort of hardcore bird watcher, and he has his list of all the sorts of UK species that he's given to me and got me into ticking them off, and there is a sort of real pleasure in that, I find. And at the same time, there's a kind of different sort of engagement as well, I think. A sort of urge to just simply to be outside, to connect to non-human nature, to recognise and celebrate the otherness of birds, the otherness of those encounters, the way in which these creatures, however much one tries to sort of tick them off and classify them, there are parts of them, there are elements of them that are beyond our understanding, beyond our sort of classificatory impulses. And it's not that one of those urges is better than the other, but I think those two things, certainly in me, have really sort of come to light through the experience of bird watching. And I see this in romantic literature as well. I think that the romantic writers, I'm talking mainly about poetry, their poetic representations of birds might be seen to engage with three sometimes contradictory ways of thinking about birds and writing about birds. So on the one hand, there's the idea of the bird as a sort of specimen, as a natural historical specimen, and of course we're surrounded by these specimens here. So that's the first one. And then there's a different way, another form of collecting or control, which isn't really about the birds at all. It's the bird as a kind of symbol. So the bird is representing something other than the bird. Often birds are symbols or metaphors for poets. There's a long literary tradition going well before the Romantic period of the bird standing for the figure of the poet in some way, as a creator. So that's the second one. And then I think you also see in some Romantic writing something else, the sense of the bird as a non-human other, as a being that one encounters and one might have some kind of relationship with through that encounter, but also there's a certain element of the bird that's somehow withdrawn, that's different, that's beyond our comprehension. I'm not going to talk about Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner in any detail, but I think that's a very good example of an encounter, a crucial encounter between the mariner and the albatross, an encounter that ends tragically and has all kinds of terrible consequences. One of the leading theorists of sort of culture and ecology is a guy called Timothy Morton, who was recently featured in The Guardian. I think he might have been on Newsnight recently as well, so he's sort of coming into the mainstream. And one of Morton's ideas is that of the strange stranger. So he talks about our encounters with non-humans as encounters with strange strangers. So rather than the idea of the stranger, where a stranger eventually could be converted into a friend, the strange stranger, whatever kind of relationship one has with him or her, remains somehow other, remains somehow different. And I think that's, for me, quite an interesting way of thinking about the ways in which writers try and represent birds. Could we have the next slide, please, Will? Apologies for the size of the words, but I will read them. So, often representations of birds for romantic writers come up against the problem of knowledge. How much can we really know about them? How much can we know about what they think, why they do certain things, why they don't do other things? Also, how much can we know about where they go? Obviously, we have a lot more knowledge about that now. So this is, just there is the history of, or the first volume of the History of British Birds by the great engraver Thomas Bewick. Bewick's book, which is a real masterpiece, gave details of species observed across the British Isles, illustrated in, I think, more sort of accurately than had ever been done before. And he talked also about their sort of habits, their migratory patterns insofar as they were known and so on. In his introduction to the second volume, Water Birds, Bewick contemplates the birds' ceaseless traversing's around the globe. And he talks about their role in the world's ecology as evidence of the dispensation of an all-wise providence. And you often get this rhetoric in writing about natural history in the period, the idea that the sort of beauty and order of the natural world reveals that there is a benevolent and wise God sort of running it all, or at least who set it all up. Bewick goes on to imagine the various far-flung parts of the world to which these birds retire to breed, such as the vast sweep of the Arctic zone. And then for those of you who can see it, this is the quotation up there. There, he says, a barrier is put to further inquiry, beyond which the prying eye of man must not look. And there his imagination only must take the view to supply the place of reality. In these forlorn regions of unknowable dreary space, this reservoir of frost and snow, even here, so far as human intelligence has been able to penetrate, there appears to subsist an abundance of animals in the air and in the waters. So there's a sense there of sort of awe that even in these far-flung, inhospitable regions there, insofar as one could ever know at the time, there is a sort of a thriving ecosystem. But there's also a sense in that quote about the limits of human knowledge as well. The idea that this space is ultimately, to some extent, unknowable, that there's a barrier to human inquiry, that one must imagine rather than see or know. So I think for Bewick, on the one hand, his task in the History of British Birds is to collect, is to classify. He has, the engraving of the bird, and then on the opposite page there'll be a description of the bird and what its habits are and what it looks like. So it's a project very much bound, sort of enlightenment project. It's a project grounded on empirical, everyday experience, experience of the senses. And yet at the same time, he's aware of the way in which sort of birds slip beyond that classificatory, that controlling intellect, the way in which they might reveal the limits of human knowledge. And that's something I think that echoes throughout the Romantic period. Can we have the next slide, please? That's Bewick's image of a swallow. And I'm going to say a bit now about one of the sort of key mysteries or examples of the mysteriousness of birds for the Romantics, which was the behaviour of the swallow. Where do swallows go? What happens to them in the colder months? I'll come on to baffled science in a couple of slides. Can we have the next one, please? So here are some very small quotations from the great natural historian Gilbert White. The Natural History of Selborne, as many of you may know, is an amazing book about a sort of account of a localised ecosystem in the parish of Selborne, a series of letters to naturalist acquaintances of Gilbert White that is very much sort of admired and loved by nature writers up into the present day. So Richard Mabey writes a lot about White. Robert Macfarlane's written about White. I don't know if Mark Colger has, but he probably has. He's a figure who's often invoked because there's a real sense one gets from White of what it's like to know the flora and fauna of your local area like the back of your hand, to sort of really be in place. White is obsessed by swallows, swifts and martins, hirundines as he calls them, and he's particularly obsessed about where they go, where they disappear to. He didn't like to think of the swallows as leaving. He thought of them as somehow, I think, as a kind of epitome of all that was pleasant and good about English country life. He also saw them as profoundly kind of domestic birds. And so the idea that they would sort of disappear off to North Africa or wherever over for several months a year, he found slightly disturbing, I think. And he knew that they did. You know, there was people reported back, you know, they talked about the migration, but he still held on to the idea that not all of them did, that quite a few of them stayed around. So on the slide, he meant the first quotation, he says, these are from 3 separate letters. It is worth remarking that these birds are seen first about lakes and mill ponds, and it is also very particular that if these early visitors happen to find frost and snow, they immediately withdraw for a time. A circumstance this much more in favour of hiding than migration, since it is much more probable that a bird should retire to its hibernaculum, its lair or its nest or its dwelling, than return for a week or two only to warmer latitudes. So again, he's suggesting that they don't, they're not going to sort of come back and then, because the weather gets bad, go away again. They must hide somewhere. They must have a space where they can lurk. It is reasonable to suppose, this is the next quote, that 2 whole species, or at least many individuals of those 2 species, of British hirundines, do never leave this island at all. That's him and his pushing it, I think. And then the third one, I suspect that house swallows have some strong attachment to water, independent of the matter of food, and although they may not retire into that element, yet they may conceal themselves in the banks of pools and rivers during the uncomfortable months of winter. And at one point he actually suggests that perhaps they do lurk underwater, or some of them lurk underwater during the winter months. You know, White is an incredibly sort of wise and serious natural historian. I'm not mocking him in any way. I think it's more that the fact that, you know, given the evidence that was available, it was still not entirely unreasonable to speculate that some of the birds might you know, perhaps all of them might stay in England. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is a poem by Sussex poet Charlotte Smith. Not much talked about now, though more so now than she was 20 or 30 years ago. This is a poem called The Swallow, or an extract from the poem called The Swallow, which is partly a response to Gilbert White. And again, it's a poet that I think quite playfully addresses the idea that what happens to swallows and what are the limits of human knowledge. I think as there's time, I'm going to read the whole poem because I'm not has anyone read The Swallow? Anyone familiar with it? Okay, it's not a very long poem, and then the quotations will make a bit more sense. The gorse is yellow on the heath, the banks with speedwell flowers are gay, the oaks are budding, and beneath, the hawthorn soon will bear the wreath, the silver wreath of May. The welcome guest of settled spring, the swallow too is come at last. Just at sunset, when thrushes sing, I saw her dash with rapid wing, and hailed her as she passed. Come, summer visitant, attach to my reed roof your nest of clay, and let my ear your music catch, low twittering underneath the thatch at the grey dawn of day. As fables tell, an Indian sage, the Hindustani woods among, could in his desert hermitage, as if to a marked and written page, translate the wild bird's song. I wish I did his power possess, that I might learn, fleet bird, from thee, what our vain systems only guess, and know from what wide wilderness you came across the sea. I would a little while restrain your rapid wing, that I might hear whether on clouds that bring the rain you sailed above the western main, the wind your charioteer. In Afric does the sultry gale through spicy bower and palmy grove bear the repeated cuckoo's tale? Dwells there a time the wandering rail, or the itinerant dove? Were you in Asia? O relate if there your fabled sister's woes she seemed in sorrow to narrate, or sings she but to celebrate her nuptials with the rose? I would inquire how journeying long the vast and pathless ocean o'er, you ply again those pinions strong, and come to build anew among the scenes you left before. But if, as colder breezes blow, prophetic of the waning year, you hide, though none know when or how, in the cliff's excavated brow, and linger torpid here. Thus lost to life, what favouring dream bids you to happier hours awake, and tells that dancing in the beam, the light gnat hovers o'er the stream, the mayfly on the lake? Or if, by instinct taught to know, approaching dearth of insect food, to isles and willowy aites you go, and crowding on the pliant bough, sink in the dimpling flood. How learn ye, while the cold waves boom your deep and oozy couch above, the time when flowers are promised bloom, and call you from your transient tomb to light and life and love? Alas, how little can be known, her sacred veil where nature draws. Let baffled science humbly own her mysteries understood alone by him who gives her laws. Okay, so that's Charlotte Smith, it's The Swallow. I think it's a really interesting poem. She actually footnotes White several times in the last few stanzas when she talks about whether the swallows hide in excavated holes in cliffs or possibly even underwater. So in this passage here, which I'll sort of point out a few things as we go, so just after she writes of a Hindu sage who can translate birdsong, she talks about what sort of questions she would like to ask the swallow. She'd like to know what she calls our vain systems can only guess. And again, it's that idea of what are the limits of human knowledge? What are the limits of the sort of systems of the Enlightenment? Where does that stop? What remains and will remain mysterious? So she says, I'd ask how you're able to travel so far across the ocean. How are you able to keep your pinions strong, your wings strong? And how do you know where to come back to? Can we have the next slide, please? Well, she also, as I was saying, imagines the swallows going underwater, or if by instinct taught to know, approaching dearth of insect food, to isles and willowy aites you go, and crowding on the pliant bough, sink in the dimpling flood. And I think that line, the dimpling flood, sink in the dimpling flood, is quite lovely, the idea of the sort of the dimples, sort of little hollows almost being created for the swallows to sort of go into and sink down to the bottom. And I think it's quite hard to get the tone of what's happening here. I'm not sure she's suggesting in any serious way that swallows sort of live underwater and then through some sort of almost magical process know when it's time to rise up again. I think she's presenting it as a sort of possibility, as a sort of playful fantasy. The key thing, I think, for her is that ultimately, as the final line suggests, let baffled science humbly own her mysteries understood alone by him who gives her laws. That again, science has its limits, and there is a kind of providence beyond it that ultimately will remain mysterious. Now, I'm not saying that Smith is typical in this. There were certainly natural historians in the Romantic period and after who thought that ultimately all the mysteries of Providence could be revealed, and that might actually be a way of getting closer to Providence. So it's, there's a different argument. But nonetheless, that's where the idea that Smith is playing with, and that's where she's ending up. So just through the consideration of sort of debates around what happens to swallows, she's able to make some quite large claims about the limits of science and the limits of knowledge from this quite sort of small and specific example. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to talk about birds as symbols. If we could have the next slide, please. So here we have, shall I call the bird? I'll come back to that. The cuckoo on the left, and the skylark, as you can see, or the lavrock, that it's sometimes called, on the right. And they'll be the two birds I'll be talking about. And I think these two birds are particularly interesting birds for, you know, if you want to use birds as symbols, you're naturally inclined to write about birds that are often heard but rarely seen. So obviously cuckoos and skylarks and nightingales are seen, but they're much easier to hear than they are to see. So I think that's part of the attraction of those species. The cuckoo, they're both birds as well, cuckoos and skylarks, I suppose, that have a relationship to the idea of spring and rebirth. Cuckoos are sort of controversial in the Romantic period. There's sometimes a slight horror about the idea of the cuckoo. Its parasitism is known in the period, and I can't remember who it is, it's not White, but somebody White writes about it, is particularly appalled by the idea that the cuckoo might have a hollow in its back that makes it particularly good at pushing other birds' eggs out of the nest. So there's a sort of there's something, you know, that seems to go against this rather sort of providential idea of beautiful nature. But nonetheless, White sort of ultimately reads the cuckoo and the cuckoo's adaptation as evidence of the complexity and beauty of the natural world. So I'm going to talk about Wordsworth's poem To the Cuckoo and Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem To the Skylark, and the ways in which in those two poems, both the cuckoo and the skylark are ultimately kind of absent, that they're interesting for the poets, but partly because they cannot be seen. Can we have the next slide, please, Will? So this is from Wordsworth's To the Cuckoo. I managed to lose my printout of this on the train. I hate doing this. It's the sort of thing one of my students would do, and I tell them off. But I'm going to read it from my phone. So just have to forgive me. It's quite a short poem. 3 of the stanzas are up there. But it's not a very well-known poem, so I think it's probably worth reading. O blithe newcomer, I have heard, I hear thee and rejoice. O cuckoo, shall I call thee bird, or but a wandering voice? While I am lying on the grass, thy twofold shout I hear. From hill to hill it seems to pass, at once far off and near. Though babbling only to the vale of sunshine and of flowers, thou bringest unto me a tale of visionary hours. Thrice welcome, darling of the spring, even yet thou art to me no bird, but an invisible thing, a voice, a mystery. The same whom in my schoolboy days I listened to, that cry which made me look 1,000 ways in bush and tree and sky. To seek thee did I often rove through woods and on the green, and thou wert still a hope, a love, still longed for, never seen. And can I listen to thee yet, can lie upon the plain and listen, till I do beget that golden time again? O blessed bird, the earth we pace again appears to be an unsubstantial, fairy place that is fit home for thee. So it's a typically Wordsworthian poem in that when he experiences something beautiful in the natural world, he's immediately put backwards in time. It becomes, I think nostalgia would be the wrong word, but an exercise in memory. It takes him back to childhood. I mean, you know, that's kind of how his poetry tends to work. But what's interesting about it in particular, and one could say other things about the poem, but I'm interested in the idea that the cuckoo in this poem it's not really about a cuckoo, it's about the idea of the sound of the cuckoo, this wandering voice that has the power to move Wordsworth, to affect him, and to make him remember his childhood. So he's able to make the claim that the cuckoo is not a bird, no bird, but an invisible thing, a voice, a mystery. O blessed bird, the earth we pace again appears to be an unsubstantial fairy place that is fit home for thee. So this is a poem that kind of goes against the natural historical grain, the idea of wanting to sort of define and collect and explain. This represents the cuckoo as a kind of magical, invisible creature that has this powerful effect upon the perceiving self, and actually has an effect that transforms the self and the self's relationship to the world, makes it seem unsubstantial and fairy, And quite what he's getting at in that final stanza is difficult, but for me it suggests the way in which, as he sort of goes back in memory, the world around him kind of dissolves. It's like a sort of, it's like a cheesy sort of move in a movie or something. The screen sort of does that. But it's about the power of it starts with the power of the cuckoo's song, but ultimately it's about the power of the poet's imagination. And a much better known poem is Shelley's To the Skylark, which makes very similar moves. I won't read it because it's too long to read at the moment, but I think it's a poem that Shelley would have known the Wordsworth poem. It was published in 1807, and even though Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley and Byron had lots of quite cruel things to say about Wordsworth, they were nonetheless in his influence. They couldn't resist it, really. So I've just picked out three stanzas from really from the beginning and the middle and the end of the poem. But in the poem, it's very similar to the Cuckoo poem in that it starts with the sound of the skylark, and as you probably all know, often with the skylark, you hear the song, but it's very hard to see. It might be too high, or it might be down in the grass somewhere. Hail to thee, blithe spirit, the poem begins. Bird thou never wert. You were never a bird. You're a blithe spirit, a happy spirit. That from heaven or near it pourest thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. It's a wonderful opening few lines. There are echoes there of Wordsworth, the word blithe, the idea that the skylark isn't a bird, and the idea that the skylark is sort of pouring forth its song in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. It's an interesting paradox there, isn't it? It's instinctive, it's improvised, but nonetheless there's an artifice in it. And I think it's a deliberate paradox. And as the poem goes on, Shelley, it's a sort of tour de force. He goes through a series of similes. He says, you're like a cloud of fire, you're like this, you're like that. But he can't, because the skylark is a symbol, and it's a symbol that's impossible to pin down. He sort of goes through these similes, but can't quite reach the actual creature because it's in a sense it's an invisible thing. It's a nothing. I've just picked out one of the similes there. Like a poet hidden in the light of thought, singing hymns unbidden, till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. I'll come back to that. And then the final stanza. Teach me half the gladness that my brain must know. Such harmonious madness from my lips would flow. The world should listen then, as I am listening now. So I think with that middle stanza, that particular simile, and I don't want to give an inaccurate description of the poem. That's not the only simile there, but I think it's an important one. And then that final stanza I read, we get that identification of the poet to the skylark, or at least to the skylark's song. Again, the idea of singing hymns unbidden, not ordered, uncommanded. They just sort of well up in some sort of instinctual, almost magical way, unpremeditated hymns. That word hymn as well, it's a very powerful word for Shelley. Shelley is a kind of confirmed atheist who nonetheless uses religious language all the time, and is a very spiritual kind of atheist, I suppose. So he has this idea that the skylark in some way might be like a poet who can't be seen, and might seem to be rather insignificant, but nonetheless has the power to move the world, till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. So the world didn't have these, everyone didn't have these emotions, these feelings, but the poet has the power to move them. Shelley's verse often he talks about that in Ode to the West Wind, Mask of Anarchy. Lots of his more sort of political poems are about. He worries away at the question of, can poetry change the world? Can it affect anything? And he's writing, of course, as a poet who's not really read in the Romantic period, unlike his friend Byron, who's very widely read. And he keeps coming up against this idea that somehow poetry does have this power in perhaps a mysterious and hidden way to move people, even if it's not done, even if it's kind of invisible, like the skylark. And then he goes back to the sort of same idea at the end of the poem. Teach me half the gladness that my brain must know, such harmonious madness. So another paradox there, like unpremeditated art, harmonious madness. A sort of, and again, I think it's the poet as a sort of a rather frightening kind of divinely inspired being who nonetheless has a sort of capacity for truth and harmony. He might be thinking there of Coleridge's poem, Kubla Khan. His flashing eyes, his floating hair, the figure of the sort of inspired, a rather frightening poet in that. So, and I'm going to carry on with this idea of the bird as standing for the poet with my last section and my final 2 or 3 slides. So there we have it, the nightingale. Excuse me. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird, from Keats. So there's a long history, as I was saying earlier, of poets writing about nightingales and seeing nightingales as somehow standing for the figure of the poet because of the particular, apparently sort of improvisatory and endlessly creative capacity of the nightingale's song. Both Keats and then my final poet, who is John Clare, do very interesting things, I think, with this quite traditional trope or symbol in literature. Can we have the next slide, please? So I've just picked here a few lines. There should be elisions between them. They're not all continuous in the poem, just to make that clear. So in Keats's Ode to the Nightingale, which I'm sure many of you have come across, it's a sort of impossible poem. You know, you could give a 3-hour talk on Ode to the Nightingale and not really deal with it properly. It's a sort of impossible poet to summarise or to some extent analyse. But it's a poet. It's often read as a poem about poetry, and a poem about sort of the idea of wanting to sort of dissolve the self, that sense of wanting to lose oneself, and perhaps find that sort of unpremeditated art that Percy Shelley talks about. So it's not really a poem about nightingales, I suppose, but nonetheless he does do interesting things with the figure. So the first few lines there, they're from the end of the first stanza of the poem. So it's talking to the nightingale, of course, there. "'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in my happiness, or thy happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease." There's a couple of things to say about that. The first is the idea that the nightingale is a light-winged dryad, a tree spirit. So again, that's quite a similar move, I think, to Wordsworth and Shelley. It's a sort of dematerialising of the bird as a bird and turning it into something else, a sort of spiritual force. There's also, the dryad is a classical reference, and Keats has quite as to some extent, as someone who's not part of a sort of a ruling elite, he has a slightly awkward relationship to the classics, but is nonetheless obsessed by them. There's also the idea of the nightingale singing in full-throated ease. I love that sort of compound, full-throated. And I think it ties in very well with the skylark and with the cuckoo. There's a sort of, I was going to say naturalness, which is a sort of tautology, but a sort of the lack of premeditation, the way there's a sort of beauty in that lack of self-consciousness in the way in which these birds perform. And then some later lines. "Now more than ever it seems rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. And then thou wast not born for death, immortal bird." So again, the idea of the bird as the sort of almost a perfect poet, a poet who's not hampered by self-consciousness, not hampered by context, but sort of floats freely and produces this beautiful art, but art without artifice. That word ecstasy, which is used by Wordsworth as well, And then thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. And quite why he thinks the nightingale is immortal is a very tricky sort of crux in the poem, and you'd have to sort of look at the whole of the ending to deal with that. But I think, again, it's the idea that there's a sort of, the nightingale represents more than an individual bird, but also more than a species. An idea of a sort of natural art form, a natural creativity that will flow through regardless of anything else. I'm going to come on to finish with John Clare and his poem, The Nightingale's Nest. Clare is someone who's had a real sort of renaissance in the last 20 or 30 years, both particularly in sort of university circles, but also I think perhaps to some extent in, is that something I should worry about? That looks all right. To some extent, you know, in sort of popular consciousness, he appears much more in the media than he used to. He's feted by many nature writers, as the nature writer, or certainly the nature poet par excellence. Clare is a labouring class Northamptonshire poet. He has very little formal education. It's amazing that he's able to produce verse of the sort of richness and complexity that he does, and a lot of it as well. And he's very much a hero for a lot of contemporary nature writers. How are we doing for time, Will? I think I'm going to, my voice will hold out, and unless anyone is, well, you know, I'm going to read The Nightingale's Nest because I think it's a beautiful poem, and also Clare is not someone who's still that widely read, so it might be useful to get a sense of the poem. But what I think is interesting about Clare is that he's someone who's, because he's kind of, it's similar to Gilbert White in some way, that he's sort of very obsessive about the local ecology, the local flora and fauna. And he uses a lot of dialect terms as well, typical to Northamptonshire and that part of Northamptonshire, which again give his poetry a sort of richness, a sort of vernacular richness. And I often think of him as a sort of nature poet who's not sort of up on a mountain, he's not looking down at things, he's on the ground, he's looking around, he's sort of in the dirt and in the flowers and trying to sort of find out what's going on. And you really see it in this poem, The Nightingale's Nest. Excuse me, hopefully my throat will keep going. The Nightingale's Nest. Up this green woodland ride, let's softly rove, and list the nightingale. She dwelleth here. Hush, let the wood gates softly clap, for fear the noise may drive her from her home of love. For here I've heard her many a merry year, at morn and eve, nay, all the livelong day, as though she lived on song. This very spot, just where that old man's beard all widely trails, rude arbours o'er the road and stops the way. And where that child its bluebell flowers hath got, laughing and creeping through the mossy rails. There have I hunted, like a very boy, creeping on hands and knees through matted thorns to find her nest and see her feed her young. And vainly did I many hours employ. All seemed as hidden as a thought unborn. And where these crimping fern leaves ramp among the hazel's underboughs, I've nestled down and watched her while she sung. And her renown had made me marvel that so famed a bird should have no better dress than russet brown. Her wings would tremble in her ecstasy, and her feathers stand on end, as 'twere with joy, and mouth wide open to release her heart of its out-sobbing songs. The happiest part of summer's fame she shared, for so to me did happy fancies shape and her employ. But if I touched a bush, or scarcely stirred, all in a moment stopped. I watched in vain. The timid bird had left the hazel bush, and at a distance hid to sing again. Lost in a wilderness of listening leaves, reached ecstasy would pour its luscious strain, till envy spurred the emulating thrush to start less wild and scarce inferior songs. For cares with him for half the year remain, to damp the ardour of his speckled breast, while nightingales to summer's life belongs, and naked trees and winter's nipping wrongs are strangers to her music and the rest. Her joys are evergreen, her world is wide. Hark! There she is as usual, let's be hush. For in this blackthorn clump, if rightly guessed, her curious house is hidden. part aside these hazel branches in a gentle way, and stoop right cautious neath the rustling boughs. For we will have another search today, and hunt this fern-strewn thorn clump round and round. And where this seeded wood-glass idly bows, we'll wade right through. It is a likely nook. In such like spots, and often on the ground, they'll build where rude boys never think to look. Aye, as I live, her secret nest is here, upon this whitethorn stolp. I've searched about for hours in vain. There, put that bramble by, nay, trample on its branches and get near. How subtle is the bird! She started out and raised a plaintive note of danger nigh. Ere we were past the brambles, and now near her nest she sudden stops, as choking fear that might betray her home. So even now we'll leave it as we found it. Safety's guard of pathless solitude shall keep it still. See, there she's sitting on the old oak bough, mute in her fears. Our presence doth retard her joys, and doubt turns all to rapture chill. Sing on, sweet bird, may no worse hap befall thy visions than the fear that now deceives. We will not plunder music of its dower, nor turn this spot of happiness to thrall. For melody seems hid in every flower that blossoms near thy home. These harebells all seem bowing with the beautiful in song, and gaping cuckoo with its spotted leaves seems blushing of the singing it has heard. How curious is the nest! No other bird uses such loose materials or weaves their dwellings in such spots. Dead oaken leaves are placed without, and velvet moss within, and little scraps of grass, and scant and spare of what seems scarce materials, down and hair. For from man's haunts she seemeth naught to win. Yet nature is the builder, and contrives home for her children's comfort even here, where solitude's disciples spend their lives, unseen save when the wanderer passes near that loves such pleasant places. Deeper down, the nest is made in hermit's mossy cell. Snug lie her curious eggs, in number 5, of dead and green, or rather olive brown, and the old prickly thorn bush guards them well. And here we'll leave them, still unknown to wrong, as the old woodland's legacy of song. It's a marvellous poem, I think, and I never read it aloud before, and I think reading it aloud I've got quite moved by it, actually. And I think one of the things that moved me is the sense of excitement and thrill, that he's desperate to sort of see this bird, and he recognises that the look of the nightingale doesn't kind of match the resplendence of its song. But nonetheless, he still wants to see it, and then he's excited to find the nest, and just interested in just what's the nest made out of? What's the best colour to describe the eggs? This sort of almost obsessive concern with the details, the visual details. But also a concern that he knows that this desire to experience, to see, to judge, to collect, if you like, at least to collect the experience, might be disturbing for the bird. There's a kind of sympathy there, the sense of what the bird might be feeling, what sort of fears it might have. And so the desire to sort of intrude, as it were, but also to step back and to leave things as they were. And I think it's a very powerful poem for me in that way. So that's my sort of general take on it. I'm just going to pick out one or two things. And again, I'm sorry for the size of the font, the size of the slides. So he talks about hunting like a very boy, being on his hands and knees, that sort of idea of the ground's eye view that I talked about. He talks about the bird singing in ecstasy. He's read Keats's poem. There's very obviously the influence of Keats's poem there. He talks about the way in which he marvels at the bird. There's a real sense of wonder in this poem and in much of Clare's poetry about the natural world. Can we have the next slide, please, Will? So in this passage, Sing on, sweet bird, he writes, for melody seems hid in every flower that blossoms near thy home. So again, the idea is sort of that the nightingale's song kind of makes everything around it pulse with a kind of melodic beauty. And Clare often goes back to sort of that idea and the relationship between, as it were, the poetry of man and the poetry of nature. And one of the things he fantasises about is a kind of writing, a kind of nature writing, that isn't alienated, isn't a form of mediation, isn't separated from the natural world, but is a sort of expression of it. So he talks of verse that mild and bland, breathes of green fields and open skies, a kind of poetry that breathes. And again, so he's interested in the nightingale, I think, as a figure of the poet, just like Keats is. But he's also interested in that sort of natural historical detail at the same time. And that's one of the interesting things about the poem, I think, that it's a poem about poetry, a poem about artifice, but it's also a poem about a nightingale and about an actual nightingale, what it's like to encounter a nightingale and encounter its nest. And just the final slide, please. So in this slide, I know you probably can't read it very well. How curious is the nest, it begins. And as I was saying, his curiosity knows no bounds. He's obsessed by how the nest is made, what materials go into it. And, it's just a bird's nest. Largely, even in the early 19th century, poetry is not meant to be about birds' nests. That's not a fit subject for poetry, and yet this is what Clare is doing. And then he has the moment with the eggs, that sort of fascination with the eggs and what are they olive brown or dead and green? What's the best way of describing them? But importantly, he leaves them untouched. And then finally, that's that wonderful payoff at the end. And he will leave them, still unknown to wrong, as the old woodland's legacy of song. And I really like that phrase, legacy of song. That idea of a legacy. What does the song of the nightingale leave? What does the song of nature leave in us? And I think, for all these writers, perhaps most powerfully for Clare, there's a sense in which the song of nature, and particularly the song of birds, echoes through us. That somehow there might be a connection between what it is to be a poet and what it is to be a bird. Without birdsong would we have poetry. I'll finish there. Thanks very much.